Wait, why are you just doing a preview on your own team and not the whole league? Because this is my channel and I will talk about this flaming pile of underachieving dog shit we call a hockey team, whom I love very dearly and will come for your fucking throat if you talk bad about them. Mwah. So as we gear up for another year of NHL action, it is once again time for me to try and rationalize why a group of 20 men wearing knife shoes and gladiator cosplay are dictating my emotional state for the next 8 months. But getting back on track for a second, this really is an important year for the Sens. They need to take that next step this year. Not only are the expectations for them turned up to 11, but this year they also don't have a built-in excuse or crazy distraction to fall back on if they don't succeed. In 2022, they were a young team, expected to improve, but not really in contention status yet. In 2023, they were going through ownership changes, and the franchise as a whole was in a state of flux. And last year, we'll take your pick. But this year, the new ownership has come in and made the changes they wanted. The new management team has settled into their roles, and you got a new coach and full training camp to acclimate, and hopefully no crazy off-ice incidents to worry about. You've talked all you can for the last few years. Now it's time to shut up or show up. But do they actually have what it takes to do so? Well, let's start up front, and there's a good case to make that they'll, at the very least, improve on where they finished last year. Yeah, they all took a step back in terms of production, but there's no reason to believe that it's reflective of their actual potential. Case in point, Tim Stützle. A drop-off of 20 points from 2023 shocked almost everyone, but considering he was dealing with a lingering wrist issue, saw his shooting percentage drop by almost 8 points, and couldn't buy a power play goal to save his life, and I think it's fair to assume that even if he doesn't hit 39 goals again this year, he's going to improve on the 18 he had last year. As for who will be helping him out, well, assuming the line of himself along with Tkachuk and Giroux stays together, then I'm sure they'll do just fine up top. But coming up behind him, and there's actually a bit of a logjam at center. After Stützle, they've got Josh Norris, Shane Pinto, and Ridley Gregg. All of them played second-line center the last few years, and they all did pretty good in that role. Now, while I think Gregg is better suited lower down the lineup, for Norris and Pinto, I'm not so sure, and it's very important for both of them to rebound this year. Now, while I'm not too worried about Pinto, as I don't think he'll be suspended for half the season this year, I am very worried about Josh Norris. He suffered a pretty nasty shoulder injury back in 2022, but despite that, he was still able to put up 35 goals that season. The problem is the injury has lingered ever since, and he's only managed 58 games over the last 2 seasons. Above all else, they need him to stay healthy, and if he can even sniff that 40-goal pace he had just a few years ago, all the better. I'd say the same for Drake Batherson, but honestly, he's been just fine. As for the rest of the offensive core, it's actually gone through some pretty extensive changes over the offseason. Out goes Matthew Joseph, Parker Kelly, and Mark Kastelik, and in comes David Perron, Michael Lamadio, and Nick Cousins. All 3 additions add something that Ottawa has desperately needed over the last few years. Cup-winning pedigree, and a bit of snarl. You think Perron's bought Zub a dinner yet? On top of that, all 3 of them can play up and down the lineup and fill holes where needed. While Perron will probably see more time in the top 6, I wouldn't be surprised if they roll him out with Gregg and Cousins on a rat line for extended points this season. And speaking of Cousins, while everyone is expecting him to fill a 4th-line spot, it doesn't surprise me that they're trying him with Tkachuk and Stützle to try and replicate some of that magic he had with Matthew and Bennett back in Florida. Guys like Noah Gregor and Zach McEwen will most likely fill out the bottom 6 roles to start the season, but I definitely expect players like Angus Crookshank, Zach Ostapchuk, and Jan Unique to get into games as the year drags on, especially if they keep playing like they did during the preseason.
What about Tyler?
What?
Tyler Boucher, what about him?
Anyways, let's move on to the defense, which also saw some significant change during the summer. So has it gotten better? Worse? Somewhere in the middle? Yeah, probably that one. Let's face it, losing Chychrun sucks, especially considering the value it cost to get him and the hype from when he first got here. But getting back a guy who's more defensively minded and who can actually play the right side fills a massive hole they've had for what feels like a decade at this point. Jensen will probably start the year next to Thomas Chabot, a guy who really needs to find some form again as he really hasn't looked like himself over the last few years due to injury. Thankfully, he seemed to have taken the time over the summer to properly recover and should hopefully benefit from more limited deployment this year. Partially because DJ's not running him into the ground, and partially because he's got Jake Sanderson ahead of him. He's shown nothing but improvement over the last couple of years, and with him entering the first year of his new 8-year extension, he's going to look to come out strong and prove that he's worth every penny. With Artem Zub and his defense likely to slot in next to him, and you've got yourself a pretty decent looking top 4. As for who fills out that bottom pair, that's a bit trickier to figure out. While the left side spot looks like Tyler Clevens to lose, I wouldn't be surprised to see Donovan Sebrango take a run at that spot later in the year. And when they did lose Eric Brancham to Colorado, they did sign Kalen Addison, who fills basically the same role.
And
and this is what I get for being late.
As for the right side, it looks pretty likely that one of Jacob Bernard-Docker or Travis Hamonic will take the spot full time while the other stays up as a 7 defenseman to rotate in when needed. But I wouldn't put it past them to give Carter Yakimchuk a look in that spot as well. While I don't expect him to be an NHL regular this year, giving him limited minutes and a more sheltered role for a few games before sending him back to Calgary just to see what he's got would probably be good for both his development and for the team to see what he can actually do at the NHL level. And considering how well he's performed during camp, he's definitely making a case to grab a spot in the lineup to start the year. Don't count out guys like Max Gannett or Nicholas Matenpalo to get some games in as well. The biggest X factor for Ottawa's success this season, however, will be their goaltending, or more specifically, Linus Ullmark. Ottawa's goalies over the last few years have been, to put it lightly, bad. Aside from a small surge of form from Anton Forsberg in 2022, it's been nothing but a mess back there ever since. So much so that Stales bailed out of the Korpisalo experiment basically as soon as he was physically able to do so. So bringing in a former Vezina winner in Linus Ullmark both excites and terrifies most fans. And let's face it, many of them are worried he won't be able to replicate that Vezina winning form he had in Boston. But that's the thing. He doesn't have to. Everyone was quick to blame Korpisalo's poor form on the team in front of him, but that absolutely wasn't the case. The team in front of him was fine. Korpisalo just couldn't stop a beach ball. Why do I think that? Well, it's because Ottawa at one point had a record of 26, 7, and 3 when their team save percentage was above .880. .880! By the way, at one point their record was 23 and 1 in games where their save percentage was 900 and above. What I'm trying to get at is that Korpisalo was putting up numbers which were way below league average, and the team in front of him was still able to put up decent performances in spite of that. So if Ullmark is able to just be average, the team in front of him is good enough to bail him out on some nights. Are you starting to understand how low my expectations actually are for this team? If Ullmark can put up solid, or at the very least consistent performances, then honestly, he'll have done more than enough to justify the trade. All that aside, he'll still be counted upon to relieve some of the pressure off Anton Forsberg, who really hasn't looked like himself since his double MCL injury, not to mention mentoring and allowing for more development time for Mads Søgaard and Levi Meriläinen. While the hope is still there that Ullmark is able to carry a starter's load for this year, if he and Forsberg are able to become a consistent tandem, then that should be more than enough to push the team as a whole a step forward. Now with all that out of the way, how do I think this team will line up when they open their season next week? Well, as I said earlier, I think the three-headed monster of Tkachuk, Stützle, and Giroux stays together to start, though I wouldn't be surprised if Cousins or even Batherson moves up into Giroux' spot at points throughout the year. Speaking of Batherson, he headlines the second line as he and Norris look to rekindle the chemistry they had back in 2022, while Perron joins them to add some snarl. Ridley Gregg, Shane Pinto, and Michael Amadio fill out a pretty solid third line that should prove to be useful on both sides of the puck. And given that they'll likely be given lighter matchups throughout the year, it wouldn't surprise me if they find themselves on the score sheet more often than not. Now, while the fourth line will be a bit of a revolving door as the year drags on, I think they play it safe with Noah Gregor and Zach McEwen to start, but I do think they give the youth a bit of a chance as I have Zach Ostapchuk lining up in between them. On the back end, like I said, Sanderson, Zub, Shabbat, and Jensen lock out the top four. Clevin takes the third pair left side, and I think Hamonic lines up next to him, at least to start. Again, as much as I love Yakimchuk, I think he goes back to Calgary for the year, and I think they need a more veteran presence like Hamonic next to Clevin as opposed to Jacob Bernard-Docker. And of course, Ullmark gets the starter's nod, and while Forsberg does get the main backup job, I do expect Søgaard and Meriläinen to get starts at points throughout the year. As for where I think they finish, well, it better be in the playoffs. Do I expect them to be cup contenders? Absolutely not. Challenging for the division? Not even close. But they should find themselves in a wildcard spot by the end of the season. At the very least, they need to be in the conversation. Taking a more realistic approach and looking within the division, and the picture does start to look a bit clearer. While I don't think they'll challenge Toronto or Florida atop the division, I do think that on paper, they're stronger than Montreal, Buffalo, and Detroit, even if the latter two are going to try and make it difficult. So that leaves Tampa and Boston as possible weak points. And while that sounds like a stretch, with Tampa's talent exodus and Boston's impending implosion, and I have a feeling that Ottawa's a lot closer to them than people realize. Son of a bitch! Looking outside the division, there's a case to be made that teams like the Islanders, Devils, and Capitals will be squabbling for points amongst themselves and possibly opening up both wildcard spots for the Atlantic. No matter how you look at it, there's a spot up for grabs in the East, and for Ottawa, they need to make sure they get it. So to summarize, Ottawa has improved on the team they were last year, and those improvements plus mounting expectations means that anything short of a playoff spot could be seen as a failure. But if nothing else, it does mean that we are in for a very entertaining season of Senators hockey. Oh, fuck, he made the team, didn't he?